Welcome, everyone, to The Third Space, the podcast for those who see the beauty of Catholicism as well as the ugliness, who've experienced real harm and real grace in the Church. I'm your host, Paul Fahey, a mental health counselor and catechist. In every episode, I will have conversations with guests about the good and the bad in the Church, avoiding easy answers or black and white fundamentalism in order to hold on to all that is true. Today, I'm talking with my good friend, Dominic. Dominic, thanks so much for being a first guest. And I feel like I know you really well. But we're going to be talking about some stuff today that we haven't talked about, even though we've spent hours together on the Pope Francis Generation podcast. This is an area that we haven't spent much time on. But anyways, Dominic, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to be with you, Paul. Thanks for having me on. I love already the premise of this show. And of course, all the work that you've been doing for the last 3 years leading up to this point. I absolutely love some of these lines, like you say, real harm and real grace in the church. I recently learned of a phrase that I've really come to appreciate. And it's not Michael Lofton's nuancing, but it's called truth stacking. So it's allowing a whole bunch of things to be true. And when you start feeling really defensive about something, just start stacking all the truth statements about things, about people you don't like, about situations you don't like, what's true, what's good, what actually is real harm, and what actually is real grace. And then step back and realize it's a mess. Now, what's an appropriate response as opposed to signing it all off or just diving completely in? I really, really hope that this is an incredible show. I mean, I know it will be. I'm so looking forward to getting, my own benefit from it and listening to it and following along with your adventures in this. So, thanks for starting this, and thanks for inviting me to help you kick it off.
Yeah, it's great to have you as the first guest. That idea of truth stacking, that's something that I haven't heard that phrase, but that's something that I often do with clients, is invite them to consider whatever situation or relationship or past trauma that they're trying to understand more, to try and hang on to all that is true. Because I think that there's, in our experiences, there's things that feel like contradictions. Like, I'm in a relationship with this person, and this other person has both done great things for me and is really good and does real harm. And if I just hang on to one or the other, like, it relieves the tension, but it's
Yeah.
not truthful, and it doesn't help me move forward. So even though there's a lot of tension in hanging on to both, the truth of hanging on to both, I believe can help people move more towards healing and freedom.
Yeah. Agreed.
Um,
Agreed.
so there's been many times on the Pope Francis Generation podcast where you've dropped bits and pieces of your story, of where your faith is at now and where you came from. I believe phrases that you've used have been things like, I was raised super traddy, or I was raised in a cult that had go bags and prepped for the end of the world on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And you've shared bits and pieces, but you haven't sat down and shared your story. And that's what I wanted to do today. This podcast is for those who listened to Pope Francis Generation. There's going to be a lot of guests on this podcast on Third Space that'll be similar. Experts coming in to talk about things in the church or things in the world. But I also want to bring people on who are telling their story, their faith story, where they have experienced the good and where they have experienced the bad, and how they're hanging on to all of it. Because I think that's just as important. It reminds me of Pope Francis's his dictum: realities are more important than ideas. And I think that I know I have a lot to learn from people's stories, and I think the church would be better if we listened to people's stories more. So we have Dominic on to talk about his. So we'll start. Dominic, what was your experience of God and the church and Catholicism as a kid, as you were growing up? Were you raised Catholic? Did your family convert to Catholicism at some point? How's the story start?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So for me, this is fresh ground or untrodden ground. I am not used to sharing my story, and I think people who, I don't know what the word is, deprogram from a cult or work their way out of a cult or whatever it is, um, have a very hard time acknowledging, again, the truth stacking of a thing. It's so easy to leave a harmful situation and then just consign everything to fires of hell and then never go back and think about it or work through it. It's really hard to be able to look at all of the fact that there were truly good people in spite of everything, that's going on inside a thing. So I have to credit the wonderful work happening over at the Trad Recovery community, tradrecovery.com. Um, I spoke with their founder, actually on the Smart Catholics channel, and she's such an
Laura,
inspiration
right? Laura
for
Van.
me. Yeah, Laura, that's right. Miss Happy Catholic. And so I went and for the first time tried my hand at writing down more overtly some of my story. A couple of years back, I'd gotten close to it, which has started giving me the confidence to sharing things like the fact that we were an apocalyptic cult. Um, there was so much discussion growing up about how horrible people were who left the group, who left this thing, and the bad opinions they had and how they got everything wrong. And it took years to be able to own up or just to be able to see what I was doing, carrying a ton of guilt, carrying a ton of baggage that I didn't actually believe in anymore. I don't want to be carrying. Um, yes, to start answering your question, I was born a cradle Catholic. Um, my parents were deeply involved with actually one of the cults that Pope Francis has decried coming out of Brazil. He specifically refers to them as speaking out of both sides of their mouths, and uh, it was normal growing up. This was just how you are Catholic, and uh, gosh, we grew up attending all sorts of different rites in the church. And now looking back, I can see kind of what was going on. My parents trying to play the field, and um, this particular group, this particular cult, had a very careful line it was trying to ride, where they wanted to practice this sense of isolationism from the rest of the world, and at the same time, the rest of the world is where you get your money. So they had to play a careful line between how much they collaborate with the institutional church and how overt they are with what they actually think about anything. So groups like the SSPX would straight up say, yeah, Pope's not Pope and there's no continuity or whatever. Well, this group would functionally think that way, but then not actually say that, because saying that obviously puts you out of joint with the rest of the church. And of course that affects your ability to fundraise and reach people and, run missions. And so, yeah, privately we would talk about Antichrist and all this sort of thing, and then publicly smile and talk about careful discernment and decry ambiguity. Um, so, one of the ways of getting around the difficulty that this hyper traditionalist group, radical traditionalist group, had with the development since Vatican II and the Mass, some of the ways you get around that is you go to the Byzantine Rite, Melkite, Ruthenian, and of course I had no idea what was going on. It's like, wow, communion tastes better over here, and there's more art and it's just beautiful. And we're going to different traditionalist masses and so on. So there's a point at which I am incredibly grateful for having grown up with a broader experience of the Catholic thing, and being immersed from a young age and being altar boys in every conceivable rite that we could get into, and joining every choir that we could, and being involved in every festival that any of the parishes that we were involved in. If there's a festival, we were there, either volunteering, helping to put it on, or singing at it, or usually if it's at a parish, the priest is blessing something and he needs altar boys carrying thurifers and candles, holy water and stuff. So we were always involved in the local parish.
So the
Came a,
the smells and
yeah,
bells and prayers of Catholicism,
yeah,
even as a
all of it.
kid, was something that
Mhm.
was really attractive to you.
It was, and in a way, I mean, it was attractive in the sense that this was just normal. This is the good thing. And then whenever we would go to like the ordinary form, um, my parents would make a big deal of wearing, my mom wearing mantillas, and so would the girls, and my dad would pull out his big monastic rosary. They loved praying their rosaries, because the liturgical rite was insufficient or something like this. Um, so, I mean, we would enjoy the older rite largely because as altar boys, we would have a lot more to do. There was, it's a beautifully ornate choreographed dance routine, with a lot more, what do you call it? It's whatever, the robes and so on. There's so much more to do, especially with a high mass. And there's lots of people going on, and we had lots of friends and so on. So, uh, when we moved to America, so we grew up in New Zealand. That's where I was born, and then raised in Australia, a stint in Fiji, and then a year in France. And routinely, I started realizing that my dad really likes fighting with everybody. It's just part of his choleric mentality. Apologetics was his thing, and he really leaned into that. Started his own business, and so I started working then with the family business. And came a point to move to America, and he thrived on and continues to thrive on um, the what apologetics can do in a conversation to prove a point, try to get somebody over a finish line, and so on. And I started to really struggle with that, and it's partly because of my personality. I don't like entering into conversations that way. Um, Whatever. I have different charisms, different gifts to what he has. And some of that started influencing my relationship to all of this liturgy stuff that I was being immersed in.
I'm curious what your relationship with God was like during this time when you were still living at home. You were being exposed to a lot of different things. Um, but I imagine that your view of God was coming primarily through your parents, especially your father, and that
Mhm.
very narrow focused cult like understanding of the faith that you were in.
Yeah. And so I want to sidebar for a second. And use the word like when I use the word cult, I mean it in a literal sense. And I think it's the CIA put out like the 6 points of what defines cult like behavior, especially when you're in a cult, kind of like what I was in, where you dress really well and you show up in public and you're very charismatic and friendly. And you don't seem weird. In fact, you kind of seem magnetic and interesting, because we're all very well dressed, well spoken. We're all very intelligent, little kids, hyper active and up to everything and building tree houses and biking and stuff like that. Um, but it's an attitude of how we would engage with the faith. And then, yeah, you can ladder that up to our attitude with God as well. So, um, some of the things that to watch out for and to be aware of is like, when you see all of these things together is when you have to start to be very, very wary. So, devotion to an ideal or a cause or a leader, and it's more than a devotion; it's like an obsession, with an ideal, a cause, a leader, and then isolation. So, a tendency to keep isolating members. So, we were routinely cultivating a mentality of isolation from other people. Um, you know, have lots of friends and fun and meals with them, and then come home and talk about where they were not up to snuff and how we have to work harder to do better than them and stuff like that. And so there's always this gap between everybody, as opposed to establishing a sense of communion with everybody, everybody conceivable. um well, this goes to the third point: a narrative that positions our group against the outsiders. We've got it. We've got the truth. Um, and unfortunately, this is just absolutely tragic, and everybody else is lost. And maybe that can sort of lead into an obsessive um, panic to try to convert everybody and help everybody and heal everybody. And uh, but it's because you radically think that we've got it right, and God is with us and not with you, not. So that leads to black and white thinking, which is kind of the whole thing of your show, is this dualism, this fundamentalist sense of like an inability to truth stack or to handle nuance, um, which leads to no room for questions or discussion. Um, I will say that my parents allowed, there was a space of questioning and discussion that was open, but they also didn't, as we got older, didn't know how to handle some of our questions. And of course, we started getting smarter. We started just not really caring about a lot of this alt-minded stuff because heck, it's not fun. And we have, I'm going to attribute this to the kind of Latino, German, Irish rebel streak. I mean, every culture has their rebels. I think these cultures are specifically like have a genius for rebellion. And so my parents put all that together in us, and we cultivated our own internal spaces for rebellion against stuff. And the last thought is undue influence or excessive control of members' lives. And that was routinely happening from the top down, just like everything. And you see this with a ton of purity culture today. All of that was normalized within our thinking. So come to your question then. This is the environment that we lived in. God was a confusing figure, very distant, and yet we were told that he's very immediate. So my parents would encourage us to turn to Christ as our best friend, and I never could. It didn't make sense. We really were raised with a lot of these things that make a cult work. The fuel that makes a cult work is hellfire. I mean, my goodness, does infernalism keep everybody in line? Cult doesn't have, there's no room in a cult for a third space or accompaniment or toleration or just acceptance or whatever. Doesn't know what to do with themes of development and progression and evolution, even though it's exactly how we all grow up just as human beings, this deepening into our lived experience. I didn't know what to do with God. I would have a better relationship with Our Lady, with Mother Mary. But now looking back, I kind of realize, it's because I've struggled with my relationship with my dad. We still don't have a great one. And I thought I had a better relationship with my mom. And so Mary made more sense. My mom was more attentive. She spent more time with us. My dad was on the road a lot more. Now, as I'm older, I still have a very deep devotion to me. And now my relationship with Christ and with God has deepened and has taken on a complete life of its own, for which I'm really grateful. But it's one that feels very much like it's not one that emerged naturally out of, I think, how it happens for a lot of us. We see good men, good fathers, and they model to us what fatherhood is as a reality, as a concept. How God relates to all of us.
Yeah.
So
it's
yeah.
something about what you shared, and I've heard this expressed. I've heard this expressed referring to more traditional Catholicism, but I see strains in Reformed Catholicism as well. Of God the Father isn't just too distant, but there's a sense of, especially thinking about like substitutionary atonement, like he's mad at us, so he's inaccessible.
Mm-hmm.
So we have Jesus, and he's more accessible and more relatable. But
Mm-hmm.
even in some ways that we talk about Jesus, it makes him inaccessible and unrelatable. So then we have Mary, because Mary's more accessible and more relatable. Like there's this sense of like,
and then she shows up in Fatima and dunks on everybody.
yeah, so that there's this sense of like, especially God the Father, he's too different, he's too angry, he's too mad at my sins, he's too ready to condemn me to hell and punish me for any reason, that I got to have these layers of protection from.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true. Our entire religious life is insulation and insurance. That's how. And so I have a very, very hard time with a whole ton of structured prayer now, because I used to turn to it with an intense amount of scrupulosity. So a lot of scrupulosity because there was a lot of fear and because there was a lot of guilt. I I remember the one time I went and asked my dad, "How do I stop getting into trouble?" Because I got into trouble like all the time. And these were, old school parents. Okay, this is like heartland Brazil kind of thing, or coastline Brazil, whatever. So whippings and stuff like that was, we were very hard headed kids. So my parents had tried to get through get through to us in all sorts of ways. And he just quite simply said, "Stop doing the wrong thing." Gosh, that was like a light bulb went off. I must have been 10 or 11 or something. And at that moment, my life turned around. Like, whoa, if I stop doing the wrong thing, I won't get punished anymore. Wow. But so then I just basically internalized stuff and moved it elsewhere. And so now, okay, now I got to be the good boy. Now I got to be the golden child. And so all of that ability to rebel, to self-identify, and to recognize I have my own contribution that I want to make. I want to discover myself on my own terms, something like this. Our family didn't really have a space to understand that or know what to do with that, because that's dangerous stuff. You're supposed to toe the line. You're supposed to fit a mold, be a good little soldier, advance the cause, that sort of thing. So there was an incredible amount of fear, especially when it would come to things like needing to go to confession. And, you know, the entire language around and the catechesis around, well, sin and grace and hell and judgment and damnation and all of this stuff. I now have a very hard time with the four last things now, as they're popularly portrayed, because they're often, as much as we wrap them in a gilded piety, they're downers when there's not supposed to be. They're supposed to be very encouraging. They're supposed to be orienting, building, but they're not. And we don't brand them that way. We don't market them that way. So as a kid, confessions were like constant. We would go almost every week for mass. And you didn't make it. Like there would be moments where I can remember I felt I couldn't go up to communion because I'd done something bad enough where I was still figuring out my sexuality and, couldn't make communion this week. And my parents would look at me sitting in the pew like, what did you do such that you can't go to communion? You're supposed to be good. I'm like, man, so that plus hellfire was like, enough to try to keep us on the straight and narrow. It didn't quite. So this sense, like you say, of God being sort of a distant judge, and then Christ being a distant judge, and then as beautiful as all the paintings are of the Good Shepherd, and then Mary shows up, and she's this, especially among, so this group's called Tradition Family Property. They love this statue of Our Lady, and it's one of the most beautiful statues. I love this statue. But the only thing that we remember and take literally from her message is souls burning in hellfire. How the Fatima message was used to browbeat or just to beat people into fear and submission and so on. So I don't know. It's such a conflicting thing. Again, doing the truth stacking thing. And one of my earliest memories was my parents not wanting to tell us about how scary and how dark things can be, but to want to lead us to be encouraged by heaven, want to get there and to be good so that this can be the reward, positive leading. I don't know what happened to that. It just sort of fell apart after a couple of kids in a couple of years. And then it was like, this is it. You have got to get your act together, kids, because here's what happens if you don't. And then, okay, yeah, we remembered that stuff.
And the world's ending next year, so we got to make sure we get everything right.
Oh my gosh. The older we got, the clearer the predictions became. And it was like 3 days of darkness and, desperately trying to act like preppers and just not having any money to do that sort of thing, and having a rotating cache of canned beans and stuff like that in a box under the stairs. Always paying attention to politics and to the news. And so, yeah, there was a lot of apocalyptic thinking. And every single year we would look at the next year and go, this is it. My brothers and sisters would routinely ask me, what is the point of graduating high school? Why? If, I would make up like a weird answer for them that would like get them to do another day's worth of algebra. But I would really struggle with this. There's no future. I don't,
These obviously aren't your beliefs now. And as you're sharing, I'm hearing some unraveling going on, even when you're still a teenager. Yeah, when did this unraveling begin? When did you, to use a particular word, when did you begin to deconstruct these beliefs that you were raised in?
So I think the seeds of it all started happening. Um, Gosh, I must have been about 16, uh, either 16 or 17. And I decided that not decided, I discovered I really, really liked archaeology. So we grew up watching Indiana Jones, um, at least Last Crusade and
As you
what
do
was the
when
other
you're
one?
born in the
Raiders
80s.
of the Lost Ark. Exactly. Good 80s kids. Um, so yeah, we would watch that over and over and over again. One of our favorite movies growing up. And I wanted to be like Indiana Jones in some way. So we grew up, of course, loving Crusaders and ancient history and the Hebrews and Jewish people. And one of our homeschool co-ops found this thick yellow book, and I think it was called The History of the Jewish Peoples or the Hebrew Peoples or something. And I went to my mom and said, "Hey, can I study this for school?" And she looked at me like I was absolutely the weirdest kid ever. And I was an incredible dork with aviator glasses, big teeth and a big head of hair like the fawns. And she said, "Sure, go ahead." And so I took notes on like almost every page of that book, wanting to understand this world of Hebrew, liturgy and economic structure and all of this stuff, partly because I wanted to build my own fantasy worlds. And so, hey, this feels like a fantasy world. Look at all these weird words and cool stuff. How God worked with this culture in a way that feels like I'm reading Lord of the Rings. And getting through this and then realizing I don't understand how Genesis works because, being of a fundamentalist mindset, we have a very hard time separating literalism from uh, a multi-layered reading of scripture, even though that would be encouraged and recommended and talked through. Practicals of it is like there was a book growing up we would have lying around the house called "Did Adam and Eve Have Belly Button?" And that kind of uh, thinking and questions, like I would reread that book over and over and over again, and I didn't know why it would never sit well with me. So I didn't know what I was doing, but I would practice, I think it's called the Ignatian exercises, but I would do that on Genesis. If I had a video camera, what would it look like? If I could make a movie or a TV series, what would it look like? Because I wasn't satisfied with the shows that I had watched growing up. They didn't have any sense of marvelousness, magic in them, which is just saturating, the early books of Genesis. They're just riveting in that way. And so I would spend a lot of time reading and rereading and trying to make sense of the time frames. Like, how is it 6,000 years? And, how do people live that long? It doesn't make, why is there nothing in the historical record, the geological record that supports any of this? Where would the mountain have been? Or where would the rivers have started? Like everything that all of these archaeological Christians have been doing for the last 200 years, trying to map it onto the geography. And so I would spend so much time studying the maps. The more I would do it, I would have to come up with these really crazy theories, try to make sense of it, of how the earth had changed or something. And there just wouldn't be the data for it. Um, and so that's when I started discovering uh, what do you call it? It's like ancient archaeology. And that's when Eric von Daniken started coming across my radar. And people like Graham Hancock, and I can't remember some of the other names. And so I started reading these books because these guys are like archaeological detectives. And I didn't agree or didn't know what to do with a lot of their conclusions, but their research and the science that they put forth and the data that they provided just seemed undeniable. So I've been sitting with that for like 10 years now. And it does not map onto a literal reading of scripture. And so that helped me that's what started, that's how God kind of got to me, was through archaeology and the Indiana Jones of this stuff, like the age of these megalithic buildings, the incredible genius that goes into them, timelining on them, the whatever. If that is, true, and everything in the science and the geological data and the historical record says that it is true, but then the scientific or the historical establishment is in disagreement with the data. Well, what does that mean about the historical establishment? So that was a really fun thing to sort of get into and think about. But then to realize, wait, I'm doing exactly the same thing with all of the conspiracy theories and how I relate to the church and how I talk about history. And we're literalists, kind of like a sort of smiling off one side of our faces at Ken Ham, and on the other side, not exactly, knowing what to do with that. And so those kind of things are like unpicking my axioms, unpicking my confidence that the answers I was getting were ended up being what I now call a gilded hysteria. Um, this is a whole conversation. Anyhow, seeds of distrust that what I was being fed was insufficient because it wasn't encompassing everything. Um, so as a teen, that's where a lot of my reading and research was going. And then that ended up coming back a little bit later with more questions.
So it was very much a intellectual movement for you. You were being confronted with evidence that you found compelling that undermined the axioms that you had taken for granted, and that caused you to question all the other axioms you were taking for granted.
I think that the reason why those landed though was likely because I genuinely wanted to be a good boy, good kid. And I remember one of my prayers would routinely be, God, help me to see and understand you and follow you in spite of all of the filters standing between me and you that I just can't see. And I think that was a reaching towards a humility of recognition as a kid at that time. I don't know what I don't know, and I genuinely want to improve. But at the same time, there's all this fear. And so having to try to hold, what is it called? Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Trying to hold the cognitive dissonance together, and then to have the weight and data and the intellectual stuff on one side just made it all fall like a house of cards. And then to turn around and realize, being a young dad, I have always been hungering for the place that I have now found. And it took a journey through right and left brain, creativity, life changes and whatever, to be able to recognize this is what's been animating me the whole time. This desire for a God who's truly good, keeps his promises, everything you and I have chatted about over the, Pope Francis Generation show. That's been at work this whole time.
So, what was the experience of of leaving that cult, leaving cults, leaving high control religious environments comes with freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and it comes with costs. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what was leaving like?
Well, the way that it happened felt a bit like an adventure. And I had an opportunity to do something that felt obviously right and good for somebody else. So I was dating she's now my wife at the time, and the group I was staying with decided that she was a danger to the cult because she did not come from the same religious background at all. In fact, she's a lot more lax. I didn't realize at the time she was going through her own journey away from a lot of, um, well, toxic, religious fundamental stuff herself. And she thought she was sort of dating into or maybe marrying into a family that had it all together and a guy who had his head on straight and, everything seemed to be neat and organized and stuff. He had no idea what she was stepping into. And so she started asking questions and she started prodding me to think about things a little bit differently here and there. And it didn't really bother me. I remember being routinely concerned, wondering how the heck am I going to convert her into this situation? I don't know, but I really, really like her. She is a good that I want for me in my life. Sure, I was a needy, young guy. I want her to like me. She's really cool. And then the group decided, no, she's way too dangerous. We're basically losing you. You are the intellectual anchor of what we're about. At the time, my parents were going through a separation, divorce, and then finally an annulment. So I ended up becoming a organizing, centering, sanity-bringing figure for a variety of different people. I didn't know that's exactly what I was doing, or the role that I was playing. So they literally dumped her. They refused to let her come back in the door, and she was actually staying with us, staying in our house at the time. And there was no other choice I was not going to walk away from her. So it was literally a choice between my future wife, possibly future wife. I didn't know for sure at the time. So this person or the cult or the group. and all of the ideology and all of my family and all the friends and everything. And it just felt like the only appropriate, obvious good was to pick her because they all had each other. She had nothing. And in fact, she was 8 hours from home. So got in the van and we drove 8 hours. And I basically didn't talk to my family or friends or anybody since. So, in that sense of, like you ask, what was the cost? The cost was absolutely everything. The cost was my identity, my sense of self, my sense of future, my ability to actually even have any work or know how to provide. Um, we ended up actually getting married within less than 3 months because I had a job offer down in Australia. And so we went to the local priest and said, "Hey, Father, we'd like to get married, but I have a job offer. So if we don't get married now, it's probably not going to happen. And we really think it's meant to be." And he's like, "Well, let's start a 6 months of marriage prep." And we're like, "No, we actually have to leave in 6 weeks or less, a lot less." And so he said, "Yeah, come back when you're grown up, kids." So we went to another priest down the road who was very old. And he said, "What? You want to do this? Why? Let me talk to you guys. Number one question: why are you doing this?" Because I love her. And then he asked her, "Why are you doing this?" "Well, I love him." "Okay. So, Father, when can we do this?" "Well, how about Monday?" And so he literally married us 3 days later. Skipped all the marriage prep, skipped everything. And then as we were getting ready to go down to Australia, then I lost all of my paperwork and it sort of fell off the truck and was made inaccessible and whatever. And so the job offer was withdrawn, and we were shipped off to a pair of aging grandparents who lived in Tennessee. And that was it. And then my wife fell sick. We didn't realize she'd been bit by Lyme's disease by a tick. And so she'd been bedridden for about a decade now, slowly getting her strength back. And it's been a journey. So I had no idea what my identity was. I didn't know what I was going to do with my future, with myself, how to provide for my family. And back then, uh, well, over this past decade, there's been a deconstruction, and I've mentioned this, I think, on the show, deconstruction and the reconstruction of almost every point of what I understand it means to be Catholic. Needing, as I've said before, to find new axioms. There's got to be new foundations for how I relate to all of these beautiful things, how to truth stack or how to hold a third space, tension, like you've said at the beginning of this show. Um, and it's been done alone. I have not known who to reach out to, who to talk to. Um, and a lot of that has just been carrying in perhaps an inordinate amount of guilt or desire to honor the fourth commandment and not talk about these things because my dad's, I don't know, he's still providing for himself or it's still his job. And now I look at the work that he gets up to and people he's aligning with, and then watching and filling myself up and foraging and learning from all of these other people who are trying to hold this third space tension, like yourself and Mike Lewis and everybody at Where Peter Is, and watching this rise of fundamentalism and then just seeing fingerprints of it everywhere and realizing I grew up in all of this and I'm seeing it fire back at the Holy Father. And I see a lack of critical thinking, a lack of accompaniment, a lack of engagement, a hard lining into conspiracy minded, theories, an inability to actually deal with the world as it is, and a lack of an ability to actually trust in the genuine love of God. And genuinely, I don't have all of the answers. But what I found, what started turning, the thing that turned it around for me was having a child. And then looking at this child and watching her grow up and then having to punish her and having to praise her and give her the freedom to go play and feed her and raise her and then of having a wife, having my wife. For a long period, especially with COVID, there was a lack of access to sacraments. I've had a lack of access for longer than COVID because my wife would be like so sensitive that me bringing home flu symptoms would have just been too much for her to handle. So I've had to rethink, well, what do I actually say I believe about the sacrament of marriage and the sacrament of baptism? Well, heck, there's confirmation in there too. I've got access to three every single day without needing to talk to anybody. Well, my wife, sure, and taking care of my family. So those are my ordinary access, my ordinary means of grace through which Christ can like be active and transform me. And if I never had access to all the others, he could work with these. That's why they're gifted to me. Um, so I started trying to really take them seriously. And the number one thing that I realized with my little girl is there is no way in hell I could ever consign her to eternal punishment. There is no way, because watching her growing up and knowing, just as a dad, whenever she would make a bad decision, um, it would always be an ill-informed decision or an incomplete one or habituated one. And then just to ladder that up to an omniscient, omnipresent God who looks at me and goes, why wouldn't he have that same um, wisdom and tolerance towards me being ill-informed and having a bad deck of cards and a whole bunch of bad habits and stuff? And everyone's like, conflating freedom with your ability to confidently sin and deny God. It's like, no, the whole point of sin is that you're not free. The more you sin, the less free you become, the more caged and chained and habituated and addicted. And it's like, those are really, really important words and ways that we need to be thinking about this stuff. And for me to look at my child and recognize I could never do this to her. How could he ever do this to me? And then to look at my wife and to be realizing she is Christ to me, and I will never meet Christ in anybody else if I cannot find him or meet him in her, maybe even in myself. So I have to learn to love her and then to model being Christ to her. And that's where, I guess, sort of starting to wrap this a little bit, I began to realize I can't know Christ. I have to meet Christ, or I have to model Christ. That's the only way that you know Christ. And because, again, my apologetics background was all about knowledge and checklists and rigorous, scrupulous knowing of things and getting it right and articulating it well. But to now begin to realize gospel is not made up of smart people knowing smart stuff and getting past St. Peter with a full checklist. It's about, were you Christ? Have you met Christ in others? So if that's the foundation, well, then what does catechesis look like when it's built up from that? If my love for my family, it's like, how could I be more humane than God? That's insanity. And I think that's a big thing that has changed me.
Your understanding of God and your relationship with God was reconstructed precisely through your relationship with and love for your wife and your daughter. Like, it was in those relationships that you came to understand God in a truer way than you understood him before.
Yeah, true. And you can't actually communicate this in an easy way to anybody. And that's where I've so grown to love that phrase, what is it? St. Peter says, yeah, always have an answer for the hope that is in you. But if nobody sees the hope that is in you, if you're not modeling that hope, nobody's ever going to ask. And instead, we just bypass the whole hope thing and we just, rage bait and tweet storm the reasons that are in us, but they don't stem from that hope. And we just it's so much easier to short circuit that process of things because you can sell that, you can talk about that, and you can charge a course for that. But this other thing, it grows by one person at a time. It grows by modeling, and it's messy, and it's accompanying. And everything I've seen from the magisterium of Pope Francis, which I love, you've given me this phrase, the magisterium of the Holy Father, has been all of this. And I have seen him reflect to me what I've been intuiting and struggling to articulate and wanting to be real, because anything else ends up being all of this horrific infernalism where my faith is fired or warmed by hellfire instead of the gentle, guiding, abiding love of the Holy Spirit. Those are two completely different religious experiences, and there's no way they can both be true.
How has your affiliation or relationship with the Catholic Church changed? Because it was formed in this cult, but then also you haven't had access to participate in Mass for a long time, or at least not as often as you would like or you did before. And also, you're seeing in the wider church these movements, these trends towards this same cult-like fundamentalism that you experienced as a kid, but you also see real hope and truth in the teaching of the Holy Father. What's your relationship with the church through all of this?
I don't exactly know how to answer that question. I remember when COVID launched, and that's exactly when I launched Smart Catholics as well. I remember a project that came out. I don't know if it's still running, but it was really popular at the time, at least for a hot minute. And it was called Countdown to the Kingdom. And beautifully designed. And as a designer, it's like, oh gosh, this is really nicely put together. And I absolutely hate this thing because we need to be building the kingdom and not counting down to it.
Was this
We
the
got to
3
stop
Days
trying
to
to check
Darkness thing?
out.
Like
Oh gosh, probably. I don't even remember anymore what they were about.
like Father Rodrigue from Canada and the 3 Days of Darkness, or am I thinking of another cult-like conspiracy in Catholicism?
I'm sure it's probably all in there. Yeah. I mean, 3 Days of Darkness prefaces anything because it's the delightful cleanser that you need before we can all enjoy the world as it's supposed to be or whatever. So yeah, coming out of the cult, there was a routine discontent and distrust with the entire hierarchy, uh, especially because of the the liberal or leftist or Masonic takeover, the infiltration of the church fathers, at the council and all of the different mafias, whatever, real Taylor Marshall stuff. And then the Holy Father and all the popes since John Paul are like, we don't actually know how to really talk about them, and they're probably not really the Holy Fathers, or they are, but they're like thoroughly rotted through and heretical, and so let's not talk about them and let's not validate them or something. And so I didn't know what to do with the hierarchy coming out of it because I'd met a bunch of really good priests I genuinely enjoyed growing up, and then there would also be priests where I would thoroughly dislike what they're putting on the table or their attitude or whatever. And then, of course, we would end up bad mouthing them to each other in the cult and in the family and stuff. So um, I've never really, I don't think, had a very healthy relationship to the institutional church. And so then leaving it and then sort of now sitting on the edge of the inside and looking at this thing and trying to discern, yeah, what is my relationship to all of these people? And then we start learning about all the fun stuff that's happened with all the scandals over the last, well, forever, but especially the last 40 years and 30 years. And then just so there's it's not come on in, the water's fine. It's like the water's just as bad everywhere, but um what do you say? So I'm looking around and I'm starting to listen to the Holy Father and I'm trying to identify, who do I want to follow? Do I trust the local bishop? What happens if I distrust? What if I'm not in a cult, but I still don't like my local bishop or my local parish priest? What if I don't have access to anybody else? What is my level of response and responsibility? How much do I owe to the local hierarchy? And again, a lot of this is coming out of the clericalism that's fed to me, fed to us through the cult, and then to emerge into the wider church at large and to see, well, the clericalism is all still there anyway, and most parishes still function like mini cults and stuff. And it's a mess when you got a family like mine that functions with cult-minded thinking within a larger cult, and then within the church as it is mediated to all of us within this situation is also presented in cult-like mentality. So to try to detach from all of that, I'm having to deconstruct everything. And the only person that I've found that I can put my sort of anchor in has been the Holy Father himself and his magisterium. And so from there, I'm now trying to work backwards. I know that I can trust him. And it's like that line you said at the beginning with, St. Peter says to Christ, where else do we go? You have the words of eternal life. And I've gone on to forage and research and think through a lot of the other world religions to try to find Christ in them. And how, or I should say, how the Holy Spirit moves through them and has been trying to communicate through them. But then to do that and then to come back and to realize we have been gifted something absolutely wonderful and we don't understand it. And yes, we can be enriched by all these other religions in our understanding of the thing that we do have. But there's there's still too much, what do I say? There's just basically still too much clericalism with a lot of this. And when you have these pandemics of narcissism among the clergy, of these parasitic mentalities among a whole bunch of prelates, where they don't produce, they don't guide, they strain at gnats, and they swallow camels, all the stuff that the Pharisees were accused of, laying pressures on top of people. And then I go back and I look at the Catechism and realize how this is articulated. Again, this is why we started Pope Francis Generations. Like, I need catechesis here. Um, how the Catechism is articulated is different to what the Catechism is actually presenting. And it's that disconnect that I have an incredible hard time with. And then to learn, for example, that some priests or clerics will have different opinions about things that they believe are deeply true, but they will not stand up and say anything because their job is on the line, or there's a paycheck involved, or something. Now I don't know exactly who to trust, because who's gagging themselves from saying things that they think are actually true and could be helpful. So I start at the top, and I'm now trying to work my way down. I credit a lot of my sanity to where Peter is, to the work that you all are doing, helping to identify who's actually trying to help communicate the magisterium of Pope Francis, who's laddering that down to us, who's on board with that, and then to basically begin to relax and to realize I'm struggling or trying to fight a battle that is actually an inappropriate one, and that the relationship that the magisterial church has to the world is one that Vatican II has been trying to posit for the last 60 years or so. Our relationship to this is the wrong word, not ministerial church or magisterial church, the hierarchy. Our relationship to the hierarchy is different to how it was before the last council. And I mean, it's maybe never supposed to have been this way. We have our own contribution. We don't necessarily answer to the church the way, we're not under the same vows of obedience as they are. We have vows of obedience that function differently, either to ourselves or to each other. It involves the church, it collaborates with, we mediate things to each other. We have roles that collaborate with each other. And so I don't have a lot of answers, but this is now like, okay, I think I found a new axiom. Here's a new piece that was not clear to me. And now I've got to sort of navigate and discern this. And maybe there's areas where I don't need permission. Maybe there's areas where I'm the one who's supposed to step up and do stuff. And when I say I mean us, the holy faithful people of God, as the Holy Father puts it, where the whole point of the hierarchy of the church is not to lord it over us, but to actually be the servant leader that is here to minister to us. I don't know. There are so many things that now are rethought. And you change your diagrams, you change your starting points, and then the catechesis changes. And I love the new direction. It's clearer.
It sounds like you've found a space where there are some anchors that you can trust. You've shared explicitly about the magisterium of Pope Francis, but you also feel space to question and search and wrestle, and that's okay. That you can still have a sense of safety and belonging in doing that, as opposed to the environment you were raised in, where questioning did not create safety. It was the opposite of safety. Questioning threatened belonging. Do you feel like you've found that space, or do you still have a sense that questioning, searching, wrestling is a threat to belonging?
No, I don't think it is anymore. Not for me. I think something that I have rediscovered or found or just allowed myself to own is actually that rebel streak that I joked about at the beginning. The sense that I've routinely been afraid of having an opinion or stating either not an opinion, but something I'm compelled to believe it as true. Maybe I'm seeing through a glass darkly. I try to tell myself that I don't like to have opinions almost about anything if I can help it. I either just don't know, or I I'm going to go try and find out. So, um, allowing myself uh, to do that, to either start to have an opinion or to start to go and do the research that I think is needed because I'm convicted by a truth or compelled by something that I think is true and good and beautiful. But then to realize if I see this and nobody else can, um, maybe that's okay. And maybe it's actually really important. And maybe I don't have to go and win everybody over to it. Maybe I can just hold it. But to then give myself the grace to go, even if the whole world is against me, and I believe this is true, I'm going to hold it. And actually, nobody can take it from me. Being able to find that space, I think, has opened me up more to the freedom with which God treats all of us, which then comes back to the sense of what love means. Love being desiring the maximal freedom and identity of the other, and it's not to cage and box in and label and project, but it's to actually truly decide to see another person. So the more that we grow into God, the more confidence I have that I will not disappear. Perhaps as opposed to Eastern philosophy, where the more that we merge with the absolute and the infinite, the less we are and the less there is of us because we're actually dissolving, back into it. Um, to hold God as a God of love is to cultivate the same thing that when you offer freedom to other people, you truly love somebody else, you truly desire them to radically be themselves, not to be you. And so I contrast myself, what I'm trying to intuit now compared to who I was when I was dating, where I would look at girls I was dating or my wife, and I would see what I liked and what I wanted and what I resonated with and who I wanted them to be, which is extremely different. To truly trying to see them for who they are, to create a space that empowers them to go and be who they need or want to be. And then so you ladder that up, and God is doing the same sort of thing. Because what else could love want or do? And then you go back and then you reread the mystics and you reread the saints. And you sort of get past the popular infernalism of their time. And then you see, my gosh, they're talking the same sort of thing. Our Lady of Fatima has this incredible and beautiful message of hope. And it's just been derailed by a lot of our own preconceptions. And that, I guess, to sort of wrap it, is I just desperately want hope for the future. Because if I got to live, not got to, I get to live in this world for, God willing, 40, 50 years more or so. All of the grown-ups around us are like diagnosing how bad it is and how bad it's going to be. And I'm like, dang it, I got to live in this thing. How do I build a better future? What possible agency can I have? And then to realize, okay, it's not an apocalypse. It's not over next year. It's not, maybe even 10 years. Heck, the church probably has another 10,000 years in the can. So what does that mean? How do we de-stress and calm down and de-escalate and actually get productive about helping genuine people thrive and live better lives and live out the gospel? And Christ's mandates are really simple. Did you feed me? Did you clothe me? Were you there for me? Did you pay attention to me? Were you ministering to me? Not did you pass out the tracts and invite me to the local apologetics talk and sign me up to your podcast. In fact, all of those things are wordless activities. And it's such a different world when you go and live that out.
What you shared about love and freedom, it reminds me of Pope Francis's teaching in his letter about St. Joseph, where he talks about chaste love, chastity, as love free from the desire to possess the other. And he says that, and I'll read it. He says, God himself loved humanity with a chaste love. He left us free even to go astray and to set ourselves against him. The logic of love is always the logic of freedom. We are about at time. I'm pushing against my counselor impulse to ask how you're feeling. So I'm going to move towards the end by asking, you mentioned hope and looking for hope. Just briefly, where do you see hope, or at least seeds of hope, in your own? And I'll make it more specific, not just like the church at large in general, but in your own faith, in your own relationship with God and the church. Where do you see hope?
Mm-hmm. I find a lot of hope in not needing to be validated um, by others, but to actually, um, it's like coming home, being able to come home to oneself and cultivating virtues of things like detachment, patience, those sorts of things. Um, it de-stresses, it takes down a lot of the fear, because naturally you're coming out of this sort of this cult like situation. You have nobody to talk to, nobody to vet ideas off of, and so you're never actually sure if you got it right. And of course, it's all very existential stuff. Everything's on the line. Um, so to start to find these new axioms, these new foundational concepts, and then to ladder everything up from them, and then to realize that everything will be okay. I can't remember the medieval mystic who said it, or something like, in the end, all will be well. And if it's not yet well, or if it's not yet, all well, it's not yet the end, or something like that. But in the end, all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. So I think that I have an ultimate hope and peace that everything will be okay. And that stuff is not as dire and as desperate and as panicky as the pundits would put. So, as far as my faith goes, I no longer feel a pressure to level up, get it right, get everything done, and model perfection and stuff, because I routinely fail at all of that. And it's not an appropriate response. It's a fear-based response. Whereas somebody you're in a genuine loving relationship with, there is none of that in that relationship. My wife and I have none of that for each other. And it's amazing. And so then to ladder that up to God and to Mary and to my guardian angel and all the saints, and then perhaps to try to offer that to the world around. To stop being defensive, like you and I chatted about earlier. Stop being defensive about almost anything, which is so hard to do. To stop expecting things out of, I guess, the world, out of life, and just to learn to cultivate a space of presence. So I think that's for me. That gives me a lot of hope, because I stop getting so dismayed and distressed when things don't happen the way I need or want them to. So you try to live out the virtues, or what is it called? The not Mount Tabor. What is it? Where Christ gave us the Beatitudes. You try to live out the Beatitudes. Okay. When it comes to the church, I have hope in the eternal church. Obviously, the hierarchical magisterial church, I think, will probably always be some form of beautiful crapshoot forever. So I'm looking forward to what I think will continue happening in this generation. It's a watershed moment for humanity in many, many ways. So it's an incredible time to be alive. But we're learning how to connect the world together and connect all sorts of different teachings and teachers and learning together. And the bad guys can't hide anymore, because we're a tweet away from being able to, Twitter is like public confession, for good or for worse. And so the hierarchy can no longer get away with the stuff that it tried to or used to. And I think that's a good thing. If they're supposed to be servants, then they have to stop acting like presidents. And as we step up into the gifts that we're called, it's our job to not let them get away with stuff, and for things to start being changed. So I don't know exactly what the future is, but seeing a figure like the Holy Father, seeing this rise of fundamentalism that's in the church, it's a concern, but at the same time, what I'm also seeing is an equal rise of people who hunger for spirituality and for something to be real and true, but who don't find it in the institution. So that whole spiritual but not religious thing um, doesn't really concern me. That shows me the Holy Spirit is still working in a lot of these people. Sure, are we going to get it wrong? Am I getting it wrong? Probably. But the fact that we're still hungering for a truth and we're not seeing it mediated to us from a hierarchy means not it proving the point that the Holy Spirit is moving and breathing through a culture. And so I turn around and go, well, what do we do as a people? We're not a church, or at least I am not the church in the sense that I'm not a priest. I don't do liturgy. I don't do all these things. Well, what do? We do festivals, food, festivals, fun, fiction, storytelling, family, all those sorts of things. That's what we get up to. That's the ordinary common, bad way of saying it, ordinary common magisterium of the Holy Spirit as lived out through real human living. Is it messy? Oh my gosh, of course. But that's where we're called to meet Christ in each other. So this fundamentalist, and of course it was exactly my own childhood, fundamentalist urge to want to relate everything back to an overt articulation of God, a catechetical, apologetical, liturgical expression of the faith. I think that's wrong. I think it's an incomplete approach. And it's one that completely misses out on what it means to actually be alive in this world, where liturgy and religion as a virtue is a component of what it means to be God, or the hands and face and feet and fingers of God to each other. And that's where this is now my hunger and the thing that I'm now trying to explore. Where do we find God in food, in fun, in fiction, in festivals, in family? We've lost that part of the plot. And fundamentalists, of course, don't know exactly what to do with that, because there are no neat or clear answers with those sorts of things. So that's where I'm going. I want to go mess around with that and understand that.
So, Dominic, we've had hours and hours of conversations, most of it about stuff. And it was just great hearing you share your story.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything you didn't share that you wanted to add? And if not, where can people find you?
Like, gosh, there's so much to talk about. Gosh, I think that's probably a great place to wrap. If anybody is interested, they can have a look at, I've got my website, it might be in your show notes, but dominicdesouza.com. I have a ton of different Substacks because I have a ton of different things I'm in love with that I'm trying to meet people with. It's why I do all the stuff I do, is to meet people, make friends, and have fun. Probably in that order. And then out of that to discern, what is the Holy Spirit calling and moving to us? Because fun is stuff that moves us, it pulls us, it invites, it is engaging, it's in the still small breath, that of the Holy Spirit. That's what I want to discover. There's that line, it's, I think, part of my spirituality. I'll end with this. It's in Philippians, where St. Paul says, whatever is good and noble and true and beautiful and lovely, and I forget all the rest, let's celebrate that. Let's do those things. Because that's the winsome stuff, to quote Father Barron or Bishop Barron. That's the winsome stuff that people like. That's the stuff that shows that you have hope. And then maybe they'll come and ask. But I don't think we should run around our lives getting all of our arguments together, and never actually having figured out what it means to actually live. And I think the people who really, really get it are often these quiet sort of mystics, can't talk very well, but my gosh, are they beautiful human beings. And you feel holiness radiating off of them like warmth, as opposed to all of the NPCs out there who just have pat answers and they're always ready to talk about anything, and they never have a different response apart from the first thing on their Rolodex. And I totally accuse myself of that too, because I'm a brainy intellectual kind of person, which is why I started Smart Catholics, because Yeah, my compulsion or danger is to over intellectualize things. So we need a community for us sort of smarty pants people to come together to model to each other what actual, intelligent, faithful discussion can look like by people who actually want to live it out, um, and not over intellectualize things. So many mentions.
Uh, Thank you, Dominic. It was great hearing your story. Um, and thank you, listeners, for listening to the Third Space podcast. If you like this conversation, please remember to subscribe. Episodes will be released every other week. And please share it with a friend and give it a rating or review on your podcast app so that more people can discover the show. You can sign up for my newsletter or visit my website, send me a message at catholicthirdspace.com. And while you're there, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. All of your support directly helps my family and allows me to continue working on projects like this podcast. You can also join me at Smart Catholics. You can join Dominic there too, the online community for Catholics who want faithful conversations that go beyond easy answers or black and white fundamentalism. That's smartcatholics.com. Thank you for listening. Peace.